think the only link that I've been able to find between the ancestral Mesoamerican, like pre-conquista spiritual practices and Santa Muerte is those elements of native veneration that held out within the practice of venerating La Virgen de Guadalupe in Mexico. You'll see it in the crawls that they do. They'll do these long crawls towards the altar. You'll see ceremonies related to flour and offerings of flour and tobacco and the carrying of these giant statues of effigies.
Hello and welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore folklore, magic, the world of the spirits, and everything in between. In today's episode, I sit down with Ed Calderon to delve deep into the mysterious and often misunderstood world of Santa Muerte, the Mexican folk saint associated with death. Drawing on over a decade of experience working in counter-narcotics, organised crime investigation and public safety in Mexico, Ed provides a unique perspective on the cultural and spiritual practices surrounding Santa Muerte. During his career, Ed also coordinated executive protection details for high-level government officials and dignitaries, often in some of the most dangerous parts of the country, giving him an unparalleled insight into Mexico's criminal and spiritual undercurrents. We explore Santa Muerte's complex origins in Catholicism and pre-Hispanic traditions, her evolution as a figure of devotion, and her connection to Mexican criminal occultism. Ed goes on to dispel misinformation around the figure, explaining that it's relatively modern. He goes on to share his personal journey, beginning with his upbringing in Tijuana, where Catholic traditions and the veneration of figures like the Virgin of Guadalupe shaped his early spiritual framework. He discusses his first-hand experiences with the Mexican drug war, and how Santa Muerte became a pivotal force in his path towards healing and sobriety. We also discuss Ed's in-depth study of indigenous Mexican criminal culture, focusing on occult practices. His insights into these practices and rituals surrounding Santa Muerte, from offerings and altars to the significance of her colours, provide a rare glimpse into this fascinating faith. Now, towards the tail end of the show, we also get into a figure called El Caronigro, which roughly translates as the Dark Rider, and represents an expression of Lucifer, and all the symbolism you would expect therein. Now, obviously that's of huge interest to me given my area of research, but it's remarkable how similar this Mexican version of the Dark Rider is with the symbolism that we've become familiar with in Irish and British folklore of that Dark Interceptor, the rider who disturbs the journey. So that's a really interesting area there that I wasn't expecting, and I was delighted to discuss with Ed. Now, in the Plus show, Ed takes us through the most astonishing account of a shocking ritual he underwent, a simulated burial, performed overnight under the influence of powerful hallucinogens. The ceremony was officiated by female practitioners, involving treating participants as if they were already dead, and they were in fact buried in shallow graves. At daybreak, the participants were pulled from the graves and cut on the foot and palm, and had 3 secrets whispered to them. Now, this intense ritual was likely a working with kind of blended Catholic rites with elements from traditions like Paolo or Santeria. Now, Ed takes us through this in great detail and reflects on what it meant for him and what the significance of it was. It's astonishing. So if that's something you want to hear, and I really suggest it is, then go ahead to the Patreon and sign up for that. It's an extra hour of the interview, and it's definitely worth your time. To do so, simply click on the links below in the link tree and come to the Patreon and sign up for the month. Just sign up for that and then leave. It's all good. Now, if you want to hear more about my Dark Man research, then my book is out in all good online bookstores. That's The Song of the Dark Man, Father of Witches, Lord of the Crossroads. If you like my shows, you're probably going to like the book. Now, a lot of the imagery and video that you'll see in the YouTube version of this interview are courtesy of Ed and can be found on Ed's Instagram, particularly his practice Instagram. So you can find the links to all the relevant places in the show notes. I've kept them short and concise because you can really kind of explore online at your heart's content. But have a look below, and do have a look. The actual imagery is really is quite beautiful, and quite stunning, and really personal as well. So it's quite a lovely insight into a world we don't get to see often. Okay, that's it from me. Let's get on with the show. So, Ed Calderon, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the Spirit Books. Great to have you on the show.
So thank you so much for the invitation, and it's a very big pleasure of mine to join you. I've heard some episodes, and I'm excited.
Oh, awesome. So to help kind of orientate the listener in terms of yourself, your work, and kind of your areas of expertise and interest, could you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Tijuana, Mexico. Tijuana, the infamous city. Some people might have seen that in reference in the Simpsons. I think it's kind of one of the most famous mentions on pop culture of Tijuana. It has a very bad reputation as far as a city. I think it's probably the most dangerous city on the planet right now, according to some lists. I was born there, raised there, still have family there, and I still visit. um, I grew up in a very Catholic background household, which Catholicism in Mexico is interesting. It has a lot of deviations to the norm and the traditions. A big part of my spiritual upbringing was Catholicism, but also some very hardcore penitent veneration of the Virgin of Guadalupe, Guadalupanos, the Virgin of Guadalupe, basically, and closeted death worship as well. Was what I grew up with spiritually. Later on in life, I joined a very experimental police force in Mexico, which led me to go into the initiatorial kind of battles of the Mexican drug war, which I participated in for about 12 years of my life. Being in that realm, I got to not only learn about how criminals operated, but I also got to see some of the Mexican occultism darker sides directly from some criminal organizations that were utilizing things like Santa Muerte and death worship as a recruiting tool, and also as a controlling agent, and also as a terror agent. But also seeing some of the Afro-Caribbean spiritual practices like Palo, Santeria, Spiritismo, a lot of these basically kind of incorporating themselves with the local Catholicism and thriving. After 12 years of that, I was given an ultimatum by a new director in the unit that I was in, which basically invited me to work with align myself with one of the cartels in the area, and I had to bow out after that. I left to the United States, where I became a security contractor or an advisor. I've spoken to congressional committees on subjects related to cartel and criminal organizations. I train people within the government to survive in hostile environments and advise in anything related to the border and criminal issues related to the cartels. And I became kind of a subject matter expert, specifically in the realm of Mexican criminal occultism. And like throughout kind of this process of me becoming like a public figure in the United States, showing up on a bunch of absurdly big podcasts, I just started being asked more and more around certain aspects of my faith, because it's a weird faith practice, and there's not a lot of people that grew up in it, and there's not a lot of people that have experience with it directly that are public figures. So I kind of like basically showed up on the scene and started speaking about some of these things publicly. And I've been slowly but surely through a project called La Santa El Monje. I've been kind of like showing venerational practices, aspects of some of the faith and its history, and kind of like clearing the air around Santa Muerte and the where it comes from, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I've been kind of like doing the job of exposing some of the things that I've learned both directly as a practitioner, a lifelong practitioner, and also now as a somebody's kind of traveling around speaking to some of the practitioners and like documenting it and putting everything I find online.
Fascinating. Thank you. What an incredible life you've had. That's amazing. I know a lot of our listeners will be really riveted to hear more about your practice. So so you grew up Catholic, same as myself. I often find it's interesting how many Catholics end up kind of in this kind of practitioner space in various different guises and start working with the taboo symbols or the taboo spirits of Catholicism for whatever reason. But can you tell us a bit about how your practice evolved?
I think Catholicism in Mexico again is a it's a mixed bag, a very
Yeah.
mixed bag. I've been in churches in parts of Mexico where the local natives will basically dress in their traditional attire and play conch shells in the middle of mass, burn their venerational sages. It's
Wow.
pretty interesting and intense space, spiritual space. If you're ever down in Mexico, there's definitely some sort of spiritual resistance that you encounter in Mexico, where a lot of the native populations will hold on to specific traditions
Right.
and focuses. Number one is I think Mexico it has a very deep relationship to the feminine, spiritually, and you know, you go to a lot of churches and Jesus is usually to the side. Usually, what you'll have in the middle is a giant Virgin Mary or a Virgin of Guadalupe or a Lady of Sorrows in the middle. I grew up. I grew up as a Guadalupano, which is basically a very hardcore segment of Catholicism in Mexico that we are very much related to the penitents, los penitentes, basically people that utilize a lot of corporal forms of veneration, be it walking barefoot up a hill to pay a spiritual pact with her, or ritual whipping, and other forms of basically bodily bodily pressures that we apply to ourselves as a form of spiritual cleansing and as a form of payment for veneration. I first encountered the image of death, or the depiction of the skeleton saint that we now know as Santa Muerte, within some of these practices. My family used to keep an altar to the Virgin of Guadalupe in a back room at my grandfather's house. And behind the image of the Virgin was a skeleton saint that they would keep behind the painting. That was like a first indication that there was something there, but I just didn't really know what it was. There was no explanation for it. Later on, when I was growing up, probably 10 years, 11 years old, I saw the Jesus reenactment of the crucifixion, the Calvary, and behind the role player of Jesus, who was carrying the cross, who was being whipped by these members of the church who were dressed as centurions. There was a lady carrying around an effigy of a what I thought at that time was a Virgin Mary, but when you look closer at her, she's a skeleton saint. She was a skeleton dressed in a dress, holding a scythe, just hugging it basically inside of this glass case. I didn't know what it was, and slowly but surely, like, my family started explaining to me that it was a representation of the Christ defeating death. So death would walk behind Christ in that aspect. So the whole veneration of death releasing Jesus so he can come back was kind of like central to that faith practice, I guess, is what you would call it. Those were some of the first times I saw the iconography. I saw the figure of death and its veneration within Catholicism.
Right.
A lot of the things we see now are all related to folk magic, witchcraft, and other aspects of it that are kind of devoid from some of the Catholicism. But the first times I saw it and how I experienced it were really very much through the church.
Okay. It's a fascinating symbol, and I can't remember when I became aware of the symbol and and seeing the depiction of Santa Muerte, like with the scythe. I'm just being fascinated by it, not understanding it, but thinking like, just this looks interesting. And like from an Irish perspective, I was just I couldn't help but notice it had a Marian quality, like it had the kind of a quality of the Virgin, which was fascinating. Ireland's similar to how you describe Mexico. It's a goddess worshipping country, really. The name Ireland comes from Eru, which is a goddess. And you could go down a road in the middle of nowhere, and there'll be a shrine to the Virgin Mary. It's all over the place. There's just a real cult of her there. I wanted to kind of ask a question around kind of like some of the older Mexican gods and whether there's anything related to
sure
Santa Muerte. Now, my pronunciation is going to be terrible, right? So I'm just getting that up front. So my apologies.
It's fine. It's fine. English is my second language, so I'm going to do some. I'm going to butcher some words too.
Yeah, but I know that there's a ritual, there's a god called, I think it's Ziptotec, whose flayed skin is cast over the earth to make it fertile again, and sometimes he's depicted as wearing his own skin. And there's like a heavy use of death imagery in a lot of kind of like Mesoamerican like ritual culture. Is Santa Muerte in that vein? Is there a relationship there?
I think there's like a few mistakes that a lot of us make when we look at some of these pantheons of gods, and which some of them are avatars, some of them are gods.
Yeah.
The image of a skeleton god or depiction of a skeleton demigod is not uncommon in the Central Valley of Mexico.
Right.
What we first have to realize is that the Mexica as a people, where a lot of these gods were based out of that culture, were defeated and cast out by all of their neighbors, who basically allied themselves with the Spanish.
Right.
On my dad's side, we're Tlaxcaltecans, which were one of the tribes that actually allied themselves with the Spanish to defeat the Aztecs, or the Mexicas they were called, actually. And the Spanish didn't tear down the pyramids. Their neighbors did. They tore down their gods. They replaced their gods. They cast them out in a lot of ways. So today we're living with a lot of revivalism and a lot of like nostalgia around it. But when we kind of look back at what actually happened in history and some of the historical context, a lot of these gods and goddesses were buried, taken down, or destroyed, or banished by the local populace. So a lot of them really didn't survive, or at least the practice of how they were venerated, or who they were in the spiritual practice for the Mexica, that died out and or was buried along with a lot of their culture. A lot of people have tried to make the case in the connection between Mexica or Mesoamerican spiritual practices and what we see now as the cult of the Santa Muerte, or the Holy Death. there's a difficulty there, because if you look at how Santa Muerte is venerated and has been practiced for almost, that I know, that I can kind of at least verify, almost 300 years in Mexico, there's been a low-key, discreet, within the church veneration of a figure that has been called the Holy Death, or La Santa Muerte, right? In none of the stuff that I've seen have I been able to make a direct relationship between a saintly dressed skeletal saint with a lot of Catholic and Western sourced iconography and the native spiritual practices. You can see a little bit of it in La Virgen de Guadalupe and some of the venerational aspects of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which was basically a fertility earth goddess of the Mexica Empire. That was basically just, they did a facelift on her and took a bunch of imagery and a lot of aspects of what she was, which she was originally. Donatzin was the name that the natives gave her, like this Lady of Flowers. But behind that, deeper down behind that, she was probably Coatlicue, the Aztec mother goddess. You see depictions of her with two snakes as a head, a skirt of snakes, which is interesting, the snake relationship, because it shows up a lot in a lot of Marian iconography in Mexico, and also in other parts of the world where she's stepping on where the Virgin is stepping on a snake. You see depictions of her as this earth goddess, and she obviously has a big skull on her chest. That's kind of the only relationship that I see.
Right.
At some point, they took the central iconic mother goddess of the Mexica Empire and replaced her with Donatzin, the figure of this fertility goddess, this flower goddess, that turned into the Virgin of Guadalupe. You hear stories of her apparition, which are dubious. You hear stories of her, of the tilma, the iconic shroud that she manifested in, as a painting that is still to this day venerated in a cathedral that was built right next to the shrine of Donatzin, at the same venerational mound. But there's things that are, I mean, the church's story is that she appeared on this tilma, this cloth. The problem is that when you see original depictions of how she appeared originally in that tilma, she's wearing a crown. And the tilma we see now in the church doesn't have a crown, so it means it was probably replaced a few times. Also, the history of the apparition of this Virgin of Guadalupe is almost word for word the same apparition story from Spain. So they basically just took an existing story and replayed it here.
Yeah,
but you see elements of its native origins at her feet. You'll see a crescent moon, which is, the Spanish were pretty traumatized about being invaded by the Moors, and they had just got done with their own fight for independence from them.
Right.
So you see her standing on the moon as far as a victory for a victory against the Moors and their faith, which doesn't make sense for something for an apparition in the Americas, but this is what they chose. But deeper down, you'll see at the bottom there's a cherub holding her up, and cherubim traditionally don't have eagle wings behind them. And if you go and look at the story of Coatlicue, the mother goddess of the Mexica Empire, she is a virgin mother. She finds a feather, folds it in her skirt, and she gets pregnant. And when she's about to be attacked by the pantheon of her sons and daughter, which is the moon, she gives birth to a fully armed and grown war god, Huitzilopochtli. And when you see below her, you see a cherub with eagle wings, and that's who that is. That's Huitzilopochtli. That's the war god. You see a black sash on her stomach, which is an indication that she is pregnant. So she doesn't have a child in her arms. She's pregnant. So it's that other difference. There's a bunch of other native references there. I think the only link that I've been able to find between the ancestral Mesoamerican, like pre-conquista spiritual practices and Santa Muerte is those elements of native veneration that held out within the practice of venerating La Virgen de Guadalupe in Mexico. You'll see it in the crawls that they do. They'll do these long crawls towards the altar. You'll see ceremonies related to flour and offerings of flour and tobacco and the carrying of these giant statues or effigies. All of those were carried out in practice for centuries until in the year 2000, when in Mexico City we had the first open Santa Muerte altar and this face was put out to the street for people to see. The only way that people can venerate or figure out how to venerate her publicly was to take all the same practices that came from La Virgen de Guadalupe and just transfer them over to Santa Muerte. That's the only link that I've been able to find. Now, there's 3 current forms of Santa Muerte and lineages in Mexico. One comes from Zacatecas, where an effigy of the Holy Dead was basically venerated within a church, like with church consent for almost 200 years. And it's a small wooden effigy in a church dedicated to San Pantaleon, a saint of doctors, basically a healing saint. Had a small chapel inside of that church where there was a statue venerated to La Santa Muerte. This is the oldest venerational form. It's interesting because if you look at that statue, it looks nothing like what we now see as these Reaper type statues. The only things that it does have is it does have a scythe. It's more of a Lady of Sorrows like face, not a skeleton face, although it has skeleton hands. And it was usually dressed in white, which leads to the first nickname you can find for Santa Muerte in Mexico, which is La Niña Blanca, the white child, because it's a child-sized effigy. And when you would go there, she would be in the front of the room where you would venerate, and in the same room there was a coffin of a Jesus while after he was taken down from the cross, and he's basically perished in that moment. So it's interesting iconography and interesting symbolism there. Mid 2000s, there was a fire. And after the fire, they took the remnants of that statue, and the bishop of Zacatecas said, "We don't want to see her anymore," and kicked the faith out of the church after almost 200 years. Funny enough, they built an altar right next to the church, and it's now visited more than the church that was housing the saint. That's one of the roots of the faith. The other roots of the faith is in Mexico City, where you see venerational practices that are oddly reminiscent of Afro-Caribbean faith practices, Santeria, Palo, and you start realizing that that's the case because those were the prevailing occult practices within Mexico during the late 90s and early 2000s. Right. That was what was pervasive there. And the lady that actually came out with her faith and started that first public altar is initiated in Palo and has multiple times said in different interviews, and I've spoken to her a few times myself, how her heart is big enough for Palo, Santeria, Catholicism, and Santa Muerte. She says, like, I have room for all of them, she says. That's the second line. And the third line of origin that this faith has is currently the one we're kind of living through, which is this modern, kind of modern mythology of Santa Muerte, which really doesn't have any sort of linkage or lineage back to the past. It's more a social media, TikTok, people in the United States and other parts of the world basically looking at it as a moneymaker, adding elements of folk magic and divination and um, other things that really don't jive or melt into it, and sell, and it's being sold now as a product and as an export product. That those are kind of the three lineages that I've been able to kind of like see myself as far as where some of this faith practice comes from.
Okay, yeah, interesting. And in terms of in terms of kind of the folklore around, okay, I guess some of the kind of the pop history of the figure, from what I've been aware of, that it's in somehow related to criminality, as you've mentioned before, that it, as it's kind of a figure of death, that it's almost like petitioning death to spare you or to let you be the lucky one, that kind of thing. And and I don't know a huge amount of how real that is, but I mean, it's when kind of we started having a conversation, I was like, oh wow, okay, this is really interesting, given your background and then your expertise in this area. I know, could you shed some light on that?
Sure, sure. A lot of it, like as far as the older stripes of it, the older lineages of it are all Catholic based. I've looked high and low to try and figure out if there's some sort of like holdout Mexica tradition and they're trying to like incorporate something. It's just not there. What probably did happen is that a lot of the original veneration grew up around a misreading and or an adoption of the term a holy death.
Okay.
People looking or seeking a holy death. Now, our day and age, we'll get sick and go to hospital and we're just praying to die peacefully and with a bunch of drugs in us. People in the past didn't have that option. It was a thing to pray for, to have a holy death or a good death.
Okay.
To this day, you still find venerational statuary, not only in Mexico, but other parts of the world, where they're venerating a virgin-like figure of a good death, the virgin of the good death or a holy death. There's mentions in some church documents of native people in a town in Hidalgo venerating a skeleton dress with a dress, and they were venerating a holy death, or they were praying for a holy death, which was what they were saying. She's seen as an intermediary. She's seen as an agent aside or apart from God. Now, mind you, everything involved in her veneration at all the levels that I think are legitimate, they first have to, if you want to invoke death, you have to ask permission of God first. In all of them, even some of the more current, there's some aspects of it now that are kind of like tied into this neo-Luciferian aspect of spiritual practices coming up in Mexico City, where you'll have a figure of death, and to the side you'll have a figure of the devil, or their interpretation of, like, sometimes you'll see like a Baphomet figure that doesn't really jive there, but to their minds it's like Lucifer or the devil. So they're basically viewed as outside actors or independent actors that you can petition to or ask favors of. They're not miracle workers. Is a thing that you commonly also see with some of the older school kind of venerational practices. They can't perform miracles, but they can do you favors, is kind of the clarification you get. By this, I mean they are spirits or energies that are there to bend probability or to create luck or to guide you towards or to protect you, to keep bullets from not hitting you, to stall death or to allow you to seek out a holy death or a death that is meaningful, is what you kind of see in the core philosophies of it at a deeper level. You have to also realize that a lot of this is fringe spiritual practices, and wherever it was like venerated and you had it, it was usually fringe. And along with the fringes, you see a lot of the penitent or the penitente type practices, which is where my family kind of came from. The whole walking to a shrine blindfolded with pieces of cactus stabbed into your flesh, crown of thorns on your head, and seeking salvation or seeking purification through physical means or penance. A lot of that kind of like tied into Mary Magdalene veneration and her penitent ways. And when you see the ways that Mary Magdalene is depicted in some of the older forms, she's usually depicted with a skull and a candle and a mirror, kind of like invoking some of these memento mori, like transitory aspects of faith and the mystical side of it, which is, I guess, if you want to find some of the aspects of what Santa Muerte is and some of the ways that it's been kind of transmitted in Mexico, it's definitely some of the more mystical sides of Catholicism, and that's where it kind of resided for years until our days where it's kind of turned into what it is now. Like a lot of where that comes from is that a direct relationship with death in life and approaching it in a lot of ways physically. Other religions and other spiritual practices in the world, will take hallucinogens or and there is some of that in Santa Muerte that I've managed to kind of find, but I'm not too certain that is not modern. It's a lot of it is very modern in its inception. The older forms of it all took people into mystical experiences related to starvation, lack of drink, lack of sleep, and again the whole penance aspect of it. That's where a lot of the veneration and a lot of the direct relationship that people are seeking with death in life would find it. I guess is kind of like what I've been able to kind of piece together from both historical sources and people that I've been in this veneration for centuries now. And a lot of a lot of it is, if you'll see penitents in places like Spain still. Americans freak out with them because they look like Ku Klux Klan members when they with the way they dress. But there's a reason why they are masked. It's because it's being somebody that flails themselves as a venerational practice might be something that people want to keep private or keep behind doors.
Sure. Yeah.
And in a lot of aspects, Santa Muerte at its older forms was the same. It was something you hid from society. It was considered taboo, even within some of the churches where it was practiced openly. It was still considered something you would do kind of behind closed doors.
Yeah, that makes an awful lot of sense. And then in terms of how it gained this association with the occult in the criminal world, is fascinating too, and it kind of reminds me of like the cultural practices along the kind of the periphery of the islands of like, well, the island of Ireland, the islands of Britain, where they're hard places to live. Like the weather's pretty tough, the landscape's unforgiving, all that kind of stuff. That people would petition the devil to survive, but pray to God for salvation. So there's this dual practice, and the devil not being a figure that is like quintessentially evil and out for human souls. It's a different force. It's like as you described, it's that intermediary force, that can be worked with, but there is necessary for an individual to be cunning and clever how they approach it, because it's a tricky force. But it definitely it reminds me of that type of like rural understanding of where life is hard.
I have a question. Like, how do you in Ireland? How do you depict the devil? Like, is there a way you picture it? Because Mexico has
Yeah.
a few ways they
Yeah.
manifest it.
Well, he's got a couple of names, and it like in Gaelic, in the language, he's called on Far Dove or on Far Durka, which is the black man or the dark man, right? So that's kind of how he's
That's
described.
interesting.
You know,
In Mexico, there's like a very specific traditional way that they describe him, El Charro Negro, or the Black Horseman, and
really,
which which is the Huichol people in central Mexico. That's where that veneration came. San Martin Caballero, Saint Martin. It's the light side of him, and the dark side of him is
this dark horseman.
Charro Negro. Yeah, it's basically a man that appears in this black suit, fancy money. It's like somebody that has money basically appears in a horse, and he's there to make deals, basically.
That is almost like for like with some of the ways this manifests in Ireland. He would be called the Dark Rider, yeah, and he would appear like I don't have a copy of my book with me, but my book is called Song of the Dark Man, and it's about all these different manifestations, right? Particularly from Britain and Ireland, and how it goes all the way back in our folklore. But one of the noticeable elements of this archetype, or living archetype, or spirit, whatever you want to call it, is that it intercepts people in the journey. So you're walking from one place to another, and your journey is intercepted, right?
Yeah.
Right. And it would look like we'd call it gentry. He was often called the king of the fairies as well, right?
Okay.
So turn up in all this kind of like the gentry, like symbols of wealth and what have you, and then the person whose life was interrupted goes on some sort of like journey into the underworld, gets all the material things they want, but then finds out they don't want them. That kind of thing.
It's similar. It's interesting that it's similar. This Dark Rider, the Huicholes, describe it also as like a guardian of nature in a lot of ways. I mean, a lot of the aspects of at the base of it was that, and he's been depicted in a few very famous movies in Mexico, and you can find statuary of him. Like I have one where he's on top of a horse, holding money in one hand, and you can see his horns and his tail coming out of the bottom of his jacket as to indicate he's the devil. Depending on, there's people that venerate it openly. They'll have a statue there. It's supposedly a duality figure with Saint Martin. Like if you see Saint Martin on one end, the duality of it at night is him. And
that's really interesting.
You venerate him at night, so you have to keep him covered during the day. And if people, like as you mentioned, that people have to be cunning with him, right? So they bind his hand with a rosary, they keep him covered, or they keep a picture or an effigy of the Archangel Michael behind him to restrain him, restrain him, right?
Yeah.
And some people will actually put a chain from the picture of Saint Michael to the devil statue with a padlock. And when you want to work with him, you open that padlock.
Really,
a lot of that stuff is like very ingrained in some of those older forms of veneration around.
How fascinating! That's really interesting. And like one of the interesting things about Saint Martin in Ireland is that only up until maybe the last about 50 years ago, it was one of the days when people would sacrifice an animal to Saint Martin. So like it was normally a bird, normally a chicken or a duck or something like that, fowl. So they'd slaughter the animal and sprinkle the blood on the threshold of the house. And that was
one of the main offerings you do for Charro Negro is a fowl, a cooked fowl, which is
Yeah.
and also hay for his horse because he's
Okay.
always riding a black horse.
Fabulous. Yeah. Yeah. It's astonishing how interesting these things are. Like there's a particular as well. There's another spirit in Ireland, and it's called the rough translation. There's a couple of names for it, but there's a rough translation. It's called is like Gan Can, right, which literally means no head, right. So it's a headless rider on a black steed. Sometimes there's a spinal cord as the whip for the horse. And it can ride around, scare the hell out of people. But it's supposed to be a harbinger of if you see it, somebody's going to die. That kind of stuff.
Yeah,
There's lots of taboos like that. But the dark man of Far Dove, if he appears, it's someone's life's going to get turned on their head. In witchcraft, his appearance is related to a call to witchcraft. It's almost like that spirit wants the individual to take that kind of path.
yeah,
It's astonishing. Like the witch trials in Scotland and Britain, there wasn't that many in Ireland. It was just difference between kind of Catholicism and Protestantism. There was a slightly different interpretation in Britain and Ireland. And I mean, as you know from Spain, Catholicism, it doesn't matter then. If you're a witch, you were gone. But there's an awful lot of records in Britain, and they refer to the witch confessions, and they talk about this black figure all the time. It comes up again and again, and he's described exactly as you're saying. The feet would be hooved, black figure, dressed well, shape shifting, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's in Mexico. It's like even there's myths and stories. There's in Guadalajara. There's a corner called El Callejón del Diablo. It's like the Devil's Alley. And the story goes that there was a celebration there once when the town was being very prosperous. And during the celebration, a man appeared, a finely dressed man in black, who basically did a deal with most of the townspeople there. And none of that turned out too well for any of them, apparently, which is like a common theme. You hear the same story here in Tijuana, for example, my hometown. Of a disco club that was very popular back in the 70s and 80s. Of this lady seemingly dancing with herself, and all of a sudden, people started saying that there was this black figure that had hooves who was dancing with her. And it's this giant case of hysteria in this place. That place was closed down. It's like a common theme, basically. Yeah. It repeats a lot. And right now we're living through this just explosion of that. This Santa Muerte is one of the fastest growing faith practices. People self-identify themselves as the devotees of death in Mexico. And a lot of those same types of people are now also outing themselves as Luciferian venerational practices from Mexico City that are also coming up. A lot of them are what they say they're Luciferians, and if you go and look at the history of Luciferianism, or even some of the modern stuff, the LaVey stuff, it's completely different than all of that. It's more. It's like a popular expression. They're making it up as they go. Really. The way that you see their veneration, there's a specific temple in the state of Mexico. They named their Luciferian spirit the Black Angel, but in diminutive, the El Angelito Negro, the small black angel, is what they call this figure. But when you go there and you see the venerational practices around it, it's all palo, and santeria and spiritismo.
Really?
They'll do ritual cuttings on people's backs and make all these rooms and symbols and sigils that are all taken from 1970s occultist books. It's
right. Okay.
It's all kind of they're all kind of taking from, but it's interesting that this figure of Lucifer and just Luciferianism in general, it's in vogue in Mexico. It's growing in popularity.
That's fascinating. Yeah, really fascinating. And there seems to be something to that current is coming more to the fore. There's some extraordinary stuff around it.
You could see elements of a battle going on between again people like myself, I guess, who are Catholic, raised, grown individuals that went through all the Catholic rites, who have this faith practice on the side to a death deity.
Yeah.
Who are also on the same boat as far as the devil being the enemy and something to be feared and restrained and kept restrained, or something that is not to be trusted. That's one end of it. But there's other people who are on the Santa Muerte venerational path who are like, no, the devil's like is part and parcel of this, is like this duality that they have. So that's kind of like the deviation that you're now seeing as far as both faith practices. It's interesting that they
that makes sense.
Betting on both sides, basically.
Yeah. I'm blown away that almost the same expression in two different sides of the ocean for the Stark Rider. How interesting is that? But one thing I really wanted to ask you about is in as part of your career, and what astonishing work you very brave work to do. What did you come up against? You say when we kind of opened up the conversation, you mentioned how you saw kind of the occult was used for kind of different kind of ways to influence people, to initiate them into a group, or to maintain control, or to frighten people into kind of adherence to whatever the kind of the cartel want. How did that play out? I mean, was there groups of the cartel that genuinely believed in what they were doing? That was their religion, as it were.
So it's interesting because Mexico it's a different place, and I always make this delineation because Mexico is a surreal environment. I remember being kind of presented into the unit that I was going to be a part of as a new guy, and the older guy said, "Well, the first thing we need to do is go ask for protection." Right. So I thought we were headed to church. So we stopped off at a liquor store. I bought a bottle of tequila. Like, it was like, how much are we talking about? Like, something you would buy for yourself, buy it, right? So I bought this bottle of tequila, and we didn't go to the church. We went to an altar of death, and that's when it clicked for me that a lot of the people that I was working with were all also death worshippers. It was a different type of death worship than I was accustomed to, because all the stuff that I grew up with was all behind closed doors. It was done on certain Good Friday and all that. Like, there was a bunch of things that were done just behind closed. Nothing was that overt. And all of a sudden, I find myself kneeling in front of this giant Reaper statue, surrounded by spent candles and some lit candles, and the figure of a woman, a bruja, a witch, a lady, she's self-described witch, standing next to it, giving me a cleansing ritual, or a limpia, and taking the bottle of tequila, taking some swigs of it and spitting it around me as a way of cleansing me off, and dumping the rest of the bottle over the statue as an offering. It was shocking. I didn't kind of know what to make of any of it, but slowly but surely it dawned on me that a lot of the people that I was working with were adopting some of this iconography, some of this faith, some of these practices as a way of camouflage, social lubrication. Um, we were going to face an enemy that had this as a faith practice, so a lot of them were adopting it for themselves as a way of understanding it, or I don't know, utilizing it. Our our higher ups had venerational altars in their offices, which was like kind of surreal to see. That this is early 2000s. A lot of this stuff this is 2004. A lot of this was just reaching the mainstream. It hadn't shown up in social media or movies yet. So it was new in a lot of ways. Out there in the criminal side, there was practices of all types. Some of them were Santa Muerte, which it was a very dark form of the faith. It was they had a tradition, and it's a tradition that I was introduced to. If you are a faithful practitioner of La Santa and you want to prove your veneration, you have to steal a statue, you have to buy a statue, and you have to get gifted a statue. You have to have 3 statues as part of your venerational faith practice, but the first one has to be stolen. And there's a lesson in that, No, how can I steal something? No, you're stopping yourself, and your ethics are going to be an issue. You have to be capable. So the first one has to be stolen. And you would see some of these same kind of faith practices on behalf of the enemies, the perceived enemies that we had out there. They're doing the same thing. My family altar was a small wooden nicho with a bone Santa Muerte. And it was small, and it was in a closet corner or in the back room somewhere. And it had candles on it. But we would go into some safe houses that these criminals were operating out of. And what you saw there were these giant reapers, medical model skeletons painted black, with draped with a wedding dress or with a dress of some sort, holding an hourglass or holding a scale. A blacked out floor from all the fires and ritual castings, pictures of some of us or some of the leadership that we had behind us, with their eyes burnt out or needles put through their eyes, as far as them basically cursing us through that generational practice. You would see that on their end. And also on the other side of it, you would see Palo and Santeria, or people who were of the Afro-Caribbean side of things, and you could see components of them melding. I mean, but what probably happened is both of the faithful were doing their own thing, but the witches, the brujeria, the witchcraft, the sorcery, all that aspect were coming from the Santeros and the Palo people. I have a friend who's a famous rapper, Conejo, who I arrested on murder charges back then. Who is currently, he's out of that life just as I am, and we're friends now, which is pretty surreal. When I arrested him, in his backyard, he had a prenda. A prenda is basically the people that practice Palo will have the spirit of a dead individual, or a spirit. They trap in this cauldron. And it had stakes and skull and all these things in there. I knew enough about it to respect it. Like I saw it, and I was like, I knew what it was, and I just gave it a wide berth. And he appreciated the respect that I gave it, which is a common theme. Like, these things have power over people, and the moment you would disrespect it or didn't give it its place, even if you didn't believe in it, you would still give it its place. There was this famous case of one of the paleros in Tijuana who didn't respect it, who would use it to con people, and didn't feed his spirit in his cauldron. And eventually an assassin came into his temple, shot him with an AK, and he fell over his prenda, his cauldron. So the
Wow.
whole occult community believes that the cauldron ate him,
Hate him. Yeah.
and it did, and it
Yeah.
did in a way,
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
that there's it was a lot of that, basically, this burgeoning spirituality, occultism, the spirit of Santa Muerte, the Palo stuff, people adopting protection rituals, people desperately looking for an edge, desperately looking for some sort of deal with the devil or a deal with death to give them more time. All of us had basically that deal where we were trying to buy ourselves time. A lot of my friends, life expectancy in our unit was low. So
Wow.
so it made sense for a lot of us to basically have
Sure.
that as a venerational practice. And what was in my past something I kept private or in the back room started turning into wearing regalia or tattooing symbolisms on ourselves, or going through ritual, protection rituals, limpias, offerings, making a offering of either a physical offering, like if I achieve this, or if I remain alive for this year, I will build you an altar on the roadside, or I will come here on barefoot. I will walk here barefoot and give you a candle, because that's how you pay her.
Mm-hmm.
Some people try and make it seem like you can bribe this spirit, but it's like, no, she takes payment in body. Is what bodies is what they say. So
Okay. Yeah.
yeah,
Ed, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. It's been the time has just flown by. I've found it you hugely knowledgeable and generous with sharing your experiences. So I really appreciate your time and your wisdom. Um, for people who wish to know more about you and your work, or Santa Muerte, where's the best places for them to find out?
I currently have one platform on Instagram called La Santa y el Monje, the Saint and the Monk, and it's a play on words. With the altar is being kept by a 10-year-old girl and me, and she is the saint and I'm the monk. So I that's where I share most of the venerational aspects, history, anything I find out. I keep every time I find somebody that's been venerating or practicing pre the year 2000, I sit down with that person, tape recorder, and I talk and speak about what it used to be versus what it is now. So La Santa El Monje on Instagram. And for my wider audience, I have an Instagram account called Manifesto Radio Podcast, which is where you can see the rest of my crazy life, from podcast to the training I do to be with people, to some of the more mainstream aspects of what I do.
Fantastic. Well, for all the publishers out there, can you please get in contact with Ed? This is a book that needs to come out into the world. I'm so pleased you're entertaining that, as I think would be superb. Ed, thank you so much for coming on Spirit Box. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you deeply for having me on, and thank you.
Well, how about that, huh? What an amazing interview. I really enjoyed that. That 2 hours just whizzed by. That's if you listen to the full plus version of the show. That was just astonishing. So I hope you enjoyed that and got a lot from it. Do check out Ed's links below. His Instagram is really quite something, and definitely worth your time. So that's it from me. I hope you all enjoyed that. I'm Darren Mason, and you've been listening to Spirit Box. Talk soon and take care.